Welcome back to Tales from the Long Box. If you've been hanging around the channel for a while, you know that we love taking deep dives in comic book history. We've covered iconic arch nemesises, tragedy-laden anti-heroes, and plenty of classic villains who defined whole eras. But every now and then you have to bypass the A-list altogether and step into the glorious, chaotic world of the deep cuts. The characters who prove that 1970s Bronze Age Marvel writers were operating on a completely different frequency. A quick heads up before we dive in. If you enjoy these videos, consider hitting the join button to become a channel member. Members get their names featured at the end of every video, and your support genuinely helps keep the channel alive. Today we're taking a look at 3 Marvel villains who sit on completely different ends of the obscure character spectrum. We've got a walking body horror nightmare made of telepathic space bees, a psionic parasite whose story is one of the most depressing character studies in Spider-Man's entire history, and a hulking Stegosaurus man who genuinely hates humanity and just wants to turn New York City back to the Cretaceous period. Whether they're genuinely heartbreaking, horrifyingly grotesque, or just pure Saturday morning cartoon ridiculousness, these 3 guys prove why reading deep into the back issues is always worth the trip. So let's break down their histories, the weirdest issues, and why you should actually go back and read all about Swarm, Mindworm, and Stegron. Every now and then, the Bronze Age hits you with a comic book villain so completely unhinged that you just have to stop and appreciate the madness. Enter Fritz von Meyer, an ex-Nazi scientist hiding out in the deep South American jungle who specialized in toxicology and entomology, which is really just a fancy way of saying the guy was really into poison and bugs. While wandering around the rainforest, Fritz stumbles across a hive of giant mutated killer bees that have been blasted with cosmic radiation from a meteor shower. Now, a normal person like you or me would take one look at a giant radioactive mutant bees and run in the opposite direction. But Fritz sees an opportunity. He builds a psionic frequency generator to control the hive, and decides that these giant space bees are going to be his ticket to world domination. Naturally, this goes horribly wrong. The second he turns the thing on, the bees start to swarm him and start eating his flesh, right down to the bone. But in his final agonizing moments, Fritz manages to lock onto the queen telepathically, fusing his consciousness with the entire hive. His mind takes control of the swarm, and just like that, Swarm is born. It's one of those origin stories where you really have to wonder what was going on in the Marvel office that day when they came up with it. Because Swarm is basically a disembodied mind controlling a giant mass of insects, he's a pretty terrible matchup for most superheroes. His body isn't really a body at all, so punching him doesn't do much. You can take a swing at him, but your fist is basically just going through a cloud of bees. On top of that, he can fly, change the shape of his swarm, grow to enormous sizes, and even control other insects with his mind. Over the years, he's used all of this to create problems all over the Marvel Universe. He's attacked Interpol, fought the Champions in Los Angeles, and forced Spider-Man to literally cover his own suit in bug-killing chemicals just to keep the swarm off him. He's tried to trigger global EMPs with the Secret Defenders, joined the Exterminators to go after Mary Jane Watson, been eaten alive by Venom, and even gotten shrunk down by Moon Girl. At one point, he animated a Utah raptor skeleton inside the American Museum of Natural History and turned it into basically a giant dinosaur made out of bees. Because apparently, being a giant skeleton surrounded by bees wasn't weird enough on its own. He's gone up against everyone from the Runaways to Deadpool, and no matter how many times someone manages to scatter the swarm, destroy his body, or spray him with insecticide, he somehow finds a way to come buzzing back. Why should you actually go back and read the Swarm stories today? Honestly, because he's one of those characters that perfectly captures everything that was fun about old school Marvel. The idea is completely ridiculous, but the comics play it straight. At the same time, there's some genuine body horror underneath all the insanity. He's basically a walking nightmare made out of hundreds of thousands of insects, but he can also turn himself into a giant dinosaur made of bees. There's really not a lot of characters like it. If you want to check out some of his best stories, start with the Champions number 14 and 15 for his original appearance, and that classic mechanical bee madness. Then check out Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man 36 and 37, which gives you some classic Spider-Man trying to figure out how the hell he's supposed to fight a giant swarm of killer bees with whatever he can get his hands on. For something more modern and comedic, Spider-Man and the X-Men number 4, where Swarm leads his own group of villains and promptly gets humbled by a bunch of mutant teenagers. And honestly, that's why I think Swarm is worth reading. Whether he's getting swallowed by Venom, turning a skeleton into a giant bee monster, his stories have the perfect combination of horror, superhero nonsense, and old school comic book weirdness. You never really know what you're going to get with the swarm, but there's a pretty good chance it's going to involve a lot of bees. Now, if Swarm represents the absolute peak of Bronze Age comic book ridiculousness, our next guy sits on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Enter William Turner, better known as Mindworm, a character who didn't get tons of appearances or even a place on a supervillain team. He left behind one of the most genuinely unsettling and tragic footprints in Spider-Man's entire rogue gallery. Born with an oversized cranium due to an experimental chemical exposure near his birth hospital, William's mutation manifested in the worst way possible. He was a psionic parasite who passively fed off the emotional energy and mental distress of those around him. Before he even realized what he was or what he could do, his powers accidentally drained his mother's life force while he was still a child. The trauma sent his father into emotional shock, causing him to walk directly into oncoming traffic. In a matter of seconds, an innocent kid was left completely orphaned, haunted by the fact that his own uncontrollable brain had just destroyed his family. He spent his youth in an orphanage, using his powers to keep bullies at bay, getting slapped with the nickname Mindworm, before eventually retreating from the world to live in a rundown New York brownstone. Eventually, William set up shop, secretly feeding off the emotions of his neighbors just to survive. Never enough to kill them, but just enough to keep himself afloat. Unfortunately for him, one of those neighbors happened to be Flash Thompson, and when Peter Parker moved in as a roommate, Mindworm tried to feed on Peter's grief over Gwen Stacy's death. But Peter's sheer mental willpower resisted the psionic attack, and when Mindworm tried to physically lash out, Spider-Man hit him with a knockout blow that sent him straight to prison. When he finally got out, he tried to avenge himself by evading Spider-Man's dreams. But during that psychic confrontation, Mindworm broke down. He realized his entire villainous drive was just unresolved grief over his parents, reformed his whole outlook, befriended Peter, and even adopted Spider-Man's own motto about power and responsibility. Tragically, his story didn't get a happy ending. His loneliness made him easy prey for street criminals who manipulated him into another robbery, sending him back into the system. By the time he got out again, his mind was shattered by severe depression and mental illness. Living homeless on the streets of New York, overwhelmed by the deafening psychic noise of the city, William refused to use his powers to hurt anyone ever again, leaving him completely defenseless when a local gang brutally beat him and left him for dead, ultimately landing him in the Ravencroft Institute. Why should you go back and read the few Mindworm stories that actually exist? Because he is a stark, heartbreaking reminder that Spider-Man's world isn't just full of cackling megalomaniacs. It's full of broken people created by a cruel cosmic accident. He's a tragic mirror to Peter Parker, a guy who lost his family to a tragedy he felt responsible for. But unlike Peter, he didn't have support or mental stability to survive it. If you want to dive into his complete narrative arc, you only need a few key stops. First, grab Amazing Spider-Man number 138 for his Bronze Age debut, which plays out like a grounded psychological thriller set in a dingy apartment building. Then read Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man, Volume 1, number 35, and finally finish off with the Spectacular Spider-Man Volume 2, number 22 by Paul Jenkins, an absolute masterclass in character tragedy that details his heartbreaking downfall in the streets of New York. Mindworm may not have a long list of appearances, but his story hits harder than almost any B-tier villain Marvel ever put on the page. To round out our trio of weird Bronze Age icons, we have a guy who takes the absolute absurdity of Spider-Man's reptile villains and cranks it up to 11. Enter Dr. Vincent Stegron, a former assistant to Dr. Kurt Connors, who is helping S.H.I.E.L.D. analyze dinosaur tissue retrieved from the Savage Land. Now, most people would look at Kurt Connors' career and think, hey, maybe injecting myself with wild animal DNA and turning into a giant scales and tail monster is a terrible life's choice. But Stegron looked at the lizard and thought, amateur hour. Why be a boring reptile when I can be a Stegosaurus? Stegron steals the experimental formula, mixes it with dinosaur DNA, and shoots it directly into his veins, permanently mutating into a hulking, orange-spiked tail, Dinosaur Man. Unlike Connors, who's constantly fighting his inner beast to get back at his family, Stegron fully embraces the upgrade. He actively hates humanity, loves being a dinosaur, and immediately decides his life mission is to forcefully regress the entire planet back into the Cretaceous period. It's the ultimate Saturday morning cartoon villain logic, delivered with 100% deadpan seriousness. As a 25-ton behemoth wrapped in bulletproof hide, Stegron is a physical nightmare to deal with. He's got superhuman strength, razor-sharp claws, a massive spiked tail, and a psychic link that allows him to mentally command dinosaurs, or even stimulate the primitive reptile portion of the human brain and turn entire cities feral. Over the years, Stegron has used these wild abilities to launch some of the most ridiculously grandiose schemes in Marvel history. He's led stampedes of actual dinosaurs down Broadway, built retro generation rays to reanimate museum fossils, and teamed up with Sauron to turn all of Staten Island into a dinosaur colony, which makes for 2 characters on this list who have both manipulated fossils. He tried to dump dino serum into the New York water supply, joined forces with Kraven, fought everyone from Black Panther and the Hulk to Venom and Moon Girl, and even got courted by the crazy female dino hybrid scientist named Archon. But for all his raw power, Stegron has 2 hilarious crippling weaknesses. He cannot handle cold weather, regularly getting defeated by Central Park winters or Antarctic glaciers that force him into sudden hibernation. And he never learned how to swim, meaning he routinely sinks like a rock whenever he falls off a flying vehicle. So, why should you go back and read about Stegron today? Because he is the undisputed king of shameless, high-energy comic book fun. He's a villain who genuinely loves to be a giant monster and never wastes a second feeling sorry for himself. If you want to check out the absolute best appearances, start with Marvel Team-Up number 19 and 20 for his gloriously chaotic debut, where he builds Flying Ark in the Savage Land and rides a pterodactyl over Manhattan. Then jump over to Amazing Spider-Man number 165 through 166, which gives you peak wintertime Stegron trying to resurrect museum fossils while Spider-Man and the Lizard try to stop him before he freezes solid. For more comedic perfection, read Spider-Man and the X-Men number 1 and 2, where he teams up with Sauron to turn high school students and entire boroughs into dinosaurs, producing some of the funniest villain banter in modern Marvel comics. Whether he's getting defeated by a cold draft, ruling subterranean sewer kingdoms, or even trying to turn New York into Jurassic Park, Stegron is an absolute blast of pure, unadulterated comic book joy. And that's gonna wrap it up for Swarm, Mindworm, and Stegron. 3 weird, widely different B-tier villains who proved that Bronze Age was a glorious, unhinged fever dream that Marvel history just wouldn't be the same without. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the weirder corners of the long box and want even more comic book history, character breakdown, and forgotten issue retrospectives, hit the subscribe button. We've got plenty of more deep cut videos coming down the pipe, and having you along for the ride genuinely means the world to me. If you want to support the channel a little further and help keep the production train rolling, consider becoming a channel member. Members get their names featured right here in the end of the credits of every single video, and it helps me keep putting in the massive hours of research and editing these videos sometimes take. Thanks so much for watching, take care of yourselves, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one.